How do we make sense of the genocide in Gaza? When truth becomes a weapon, who gets to decide what's real? And is the global church complicit in the suffering of Palestinians? On this episode of The News and You, my raw, unfiltered conversation with the only New Zealand journalist to spend half a year in the occupied West Bank. Cole Martin put himself in harm's way to show the world what was really happening on the ground, risking detention, arrest, and even his life. According to the United Nations, at least 248 journalists have now been killed in Gaza, more than any other conflict in modern history. As the world debated headlines from afar, Cole witnessed the reality, the fear, resilience, and the unbearable cost of a war that continues to divide global opinion. We talk about what it means to tell the truth when the truth itself is under fire. I'm Eleisha Foon, journalist, storyteller, and I believe everyone you walk past has a story, and that story could change your life. So, let's crack it open to discover the news in you. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge every person, family, and individual impacted by this war, both Israelis and Palestinians. Roughly 1,200 Israeli people were killed on October 7th by Hamas militants. In Gaza, more than 67,000 people have been killed by Israel, and close to 170,000 people were injured. Nearly a third of those killed in Gaza were under the age of 18. There are now no fully functioning hospitals in Gaza. Israel has finally allowed aid to enter Gaza, but the impacts of the extended war has led to a humanitarian crisis, with many becoming malnourished. According to UNICEF, the number of children in Gaza acutely malnourished rose to over 14,000, with more than 320,000 children at risk of acute malnutrition. The conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people is one of the longest-running and most violent disputes in modern history, and a conflict that has played out on our screens, in our feeds, for the past 2 years, ever since October 7th, 2023. Israeli captives have now been returned to their families by Hamas. Reunions were filled with relief after months of uncertainty and fear. For many Israelis, it marked the end of a painful chapter. But for Palestinians in Gaza, the ceasefire offered only a temporary reprieve amid widespread destruction and displacement. More than 2,000 Palestinian detainees were released as part of the ceasefire agreement, while over 10,000 others remain in Israeli custody. Many are held without due process or trial. Israel's military continues to guard more than 700,000 settlers living illegally across 250 settlements and outposts in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, settlers have targeted Palestinian property more than 2,400 times in the last 2 years, displacing at least 3,055 people. Cole Martin was based in Aida refugee camp, a maze of narrow alleys and crumbling concrete, one of dozens scattered across the land. It's here generations of Palestinians have grown up knowing displacement as home. Families who fled or were forced from their villages in 1948 during what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe. That year, more than 750,000 people were expelled. 15,000 were killed, and 530 villages were erased from the map. What began as an exodus became a legacy, one that still defines identity, memory, and resistance for Palestinians today. And while headlines shift from ceasefire to escalation, for many inside these camps, the story never pauses. Thousands have been freed under the fragile truce, but countless more wait behind bars. More than 9,100 Palestinians remain in Israeli captivity, including over 400 children, many held without charge or trial. Let's dive into my conversation with Cole Martin.
When you first arrived this year, how visible was the conflict in everyday life?
It was really strange arriving back this year, having been there for 2.5 months last year. It just immediately felt way more heavy. I think there's so many factors that build into that, but I think one of the big things was the ceasefire that took place in January. There was a lot of hope that finally, after over a year of this genocide that had been happening in Gaza and kind of allowed by many countries, fueled and funded by many countries around the world, finally there was this hope for it to end. And then that just crumbled and it went back to an even more violent and more destructive war on Gaza, genocide in Gaza, whatever you want to describe it as, just the horror of what people were facing. And, it's happening in Gaza, but that obviously has an impact across the region and across communities throughout the world. I mean, I have friends here who have family members in Gaza who have been watching. Every time they get a call, they're worried, is it going to be family members? I was with one of my friends here in New Zealand when the call came in that she'd just lost her auntie and two of her cousins in an airstrike. And we're just sitting in the middle of a cafe here in little Aotearoa, New Zealand. So the ripples of it go across the world. And so particularly for those living in the land who are also living under the same regime, the same occupation, facing the same kinds of violence, not to the same extent or level in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem throughout the Israeli territories. There's differing levels of violence and differing aspects of it, but it's all under the same system. Geographically, we're very close to where that's all happening. So it felt very heavy. It's very easy to see as well the aspects of what that looks like for those living elsewhere in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the Israeli territories. I think that's one of the reasons that what's happening in Gaza has actually drawn so much attention from the world is finally a lot of the stuff that has been under the surface for many years that's been able to be ignored is in a very visual and obvious way. You're seeing bombs dropped on hospitals and schools. You're seeing people being starved, and you're actually able to see the repercussions of that in real time. We're watching a live stream genocide on our phones, and it's something you can't avoid. So yeah, the mood there was a lot heavier for sure.
Can you talk to me briefly about the Israeli regime, the IDF, and the relationship with journalists, particularly ones that are trying to cover the conflict and what was happening in Gaza?
Yeah, it's so like your experience of that as a journalist, as a civilian, as a traveller, as a foreigner for me being there varies so much depending on your background and on where you are in the land. So, arriving into a place like Jerusalem, you don't encounter the IDF as much. You see people in the streets. That's something you immediately notice far more of. There's, young people who've just left school. They're doing their 2 or 3 years compulsory military training. And so you just see them walking around with guns. These like 18, 19-year-olds. Another big change since last year was there's a lot more civilians who have guns. Or in the last few years, I mean, the Israeli government handed out, I think, over 10,000 rifles after October 7th to civilians. And so you just see like fathers giving their children piggyback rides and shoulder rides around the streets of Jerusalem with a big gun. So it's very jarring. But as a foreigner, as someone who doesn't look Palestinian, it doesn't feel as unsafe for me. But for a Palestinian growing up in Jerusalem or in the West Bank, it's very unsafe. I've been to Jerusalem with friends and walking around it just with them, it makes you far more aware of the danger and the trauma that they face. For Palestinians in West Bank cities, for example, and this is kind of speaking to some of the geography a little bit, if you grew up in a Palestinian city, you're in Area A, which is Palestinian controlled, Palestinian administered. And so you don't really see the soldiers in those cities unless they're doing nighttime raids. And that happens quite often. They'll have military coming in and raiding the refugee camps or the cities, the neighborhoods. But otherwise you don't really encounter them unless you're traveling between towns, in which case you encounter the soldiers at checkpoints or at roadblocks. And that's scary because people, get taken out of their car, people can get taken aside and beaten, and just the general intimidation that stuff could happen, or the threats or the dehumanizing language that people face. And then you connect with more rural communities, and they're living far from the towns. They're living in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, which is controlled completely by Israel. They call it security control and administrative control. And so these are just like rural farming communities. You're living on your farm and you might have a settlement right next door, which is essentially like a Jewish only or an Israeli only community. So Palestinians can't live there. These communities are often built on formerly Palestinian farmland. In the case of some of the towns that I've been to, literally they have all the documents from where they bought the land a century ago or further back, and yet the settlement has just been built over top of their farmland. And that's a very different relationship with the IDF, the military. military, because the settlers, they'll just come into the village anytime throughout the day. They'll start harassing people, cutting trees and crops. They might be cutting down fences. I mean, it's different every day, but it is every day. And this is happening right across the West Bank, all these different examples of intimidation, of arrests. Many families, you speak to them and they say, we don't sleep. Mothers and fathers will stay up throughout the night watching and listening, waiting to hear if there's a military raid happening, not because they can stop it, not because they can avoid it, but just so that they can wake their kids ahead of time or get their kids in proper clothes to warn them. Otherwise, you get stories of people who have literally woken up to find Israeli soldiers in their bedroom because they've jimmied the door open in silence. A lot of the time they'll just blow the door off its hinges, or they might knock on the front door and hold people at gunpoint, but sometimes they'll just quietly sneak into the house as well. So I suppose it doesn't avoid the trauma, but it just lessens it if you can hear them coming. And I've sat with Bedouins who have spent the night on night watch in their village, watching for settlers or military coming so that they can warn people, so that they can document what's happening. Because in this kind of situation, if you don't document it, if you don't have it on video, the military, the courts will always take the word of the settlers, and they will always side with the military or the police. And often they do anyway, but at least if you have it on video, it gives you that legal protection.
I understand you were able to document some of these raids, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
As a journalist being in that space, last year and this year, I anticipated a lot more pushback and a lot more kind of control over what I could and couldn't film. But a lot of the time, soldiers don't mind you filming stuff because they've been filmed for decades. The world has seen the footage. The footage is out there and nothing's changed. There's still no more accountability. So, I'd be standing there filming settlers or soldiers as they kind of shoved and harassed Palestinians. I was filming house demolitions as they took place where, in the village of Khair in the southern West Bank. I was there last June when Israeli military and police came in and demolished over 11 homes in one day. They go in, they kick the families out of their homes and they hold them at a distance. And so all the families can do is stand and watch while the bulldozers roll in towards their homes and just smash them again and again and again and just obliterate them to pieces. And I'm there filming it. And, they come round and they take a photo of you and your passport so that it's kind of, on record somewhere that you've been there, but you don't necessarily face consequences. Other times they're a lot more aggressive. And I have friends who've been tear gassed, or they've had kind of stun grenades thrown in their direction and they've been very quickly cleared out, or they've been, shoved, manhandled, really kind of roughed up. Some people have been arrested. I was arrested last year, but not in any rough sense. I was on my friend Hamoudi's farm. He lives down in Masafat Yatta, which is this rural kind of collection of villages in the southern West Bank, smattered amongst the hillsides, but kind of scattered amongst these villages all of these illegal Israeli settlements. And these are illegal under international law, but they're smattered between the villages in such a way that they cut towns off from each other. So where, my friends as kids would walk for 15 minutes to get to their school, suddenly there's a settlement there and they have to drive around for like half an hour instead. And so these settlements, they border these towns. And as I say, the settlers come in every day throughout the day, whenever they like. And that's exactly what happened. We were there in his house and we got word that 3 settlers had come onto the farm and were harassing his father, Hafiz. And so me and a Swiss guy, a Swiss rapper, in fact, who was there, we went up the hill. And by the time we got up there, the settlers had gone. But we kind of decided, okay, well, we'll stay here to kind of visually say, okay, these Palestinians aren't alone. There are internationals here, just so that they know, because there's more accountability. You can't stop anything. But I think there's a sense of more shame that settlers feel when they commit these crimes in front of internationals. And so we were there and these 3 settlers returned and they started shoving Hafez, the farmer, the owner of the land, while on his land. And they're there with their M16 rifles, harassing him and demanding to see our identification. And we said, no, we're not showing you our passports. We'll show the police when they get here, because we had called them. And when the military police did turn up, they completely ignored the settlers who had come onto someone else's land armed and started shoving him and harassing him. And instead they came to us and accused us because we hadn't shown our identity to the settlers. And it turned out one of these settlers was also a reservist soldier. So we got accused of preventing military from doing their duty. So they'll create these kind of simple excuses to intimidate or to enforce the law. And so we got taken to the police station. As a result, we got arrested. But even that process was just all about intimidation. We didn't go straight to the police station. We got put in the back of a military car and taken to the hillside. And we sat there in the back while they kind of messed around outside and made cups of coffee. And then a couple of hours later, we got taken to the military base. And there we got given food and water, and they filmed us saying you're being well looked after. Yeah, you were we're kind of trying to prove this point that they're adhering to international law or something or other, when under international law they actually have no legal right to be there. They have no right to have a presence within the occupied West Bank. It was frustrating, but we weren't scared for our lives, because as internationals, there's a lot more repercussions if something were to happen to you. But for Palestinians, obviously, it is more fearful. There was nothing really we could do other than follow their orders until they put us in the back of this police truck. And there, bro, in front of us, there was a Palestinian farmer, and he was sat there with his hands zip tied behind his back, his eyes blindfolded. And that's when it became very real for us, because we weren't zip tied, we weren't blindfolded. Clearly, he had been simply because he was Palestinian. He didn't pose any more threat. We found out later he's a Bedouin farmer who had just been plucked off his farm by the military. And so we sat in silence with this guy in front of us, just feeling absolutely helpless, very aware that we could be the last people to see him outside of prison if he was put in what they call administrative detention, which is a legal system where you're held without charge or trial for upwards of 6 months, and that can be extended indefinitely. So we just sat in silence and drove through the night, and we heard his phone ringing the whole time, presumed like his family trying to get in touch with him, figure out where he is, what's going on. And we arrived at the police station, and he was released again within about half an hour or an hour, which obviously suggests like there was no reason to be detaining him in the first place, let alone with zip ties and blindfolds. But this is part of it. It's the fact that they can arrest people, the fact that this can happen at any time. It's the intimidation, the trauma that gets caused by that.
It's heartbreaking. And I covered a lot of this when I was in Qatar with Al Jazeera, and this was long before October 7th. And I think people are waking up to some of the human rights abuses, atrocities that have been happening under their noses for a very, very long time. Is there anything that you would like to speak to the history of land settlements and anything that you were able to really grasp while speaking to some of these families or being there as a journalist on the ground?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. The two really important things I think people should understand is both the kind of the geography of the land helps you understand some of the context, and then also the history. And both of those are very tied in with each other. Palestine is an area, or the Levant, the historic Palestine, that region, has centered between Europe and Asia and Africa. So it's been a kind of main trade route for many, thousands of years, critical both ecologically for animals coming through there and for people migrating places. It's been a big trade route. And so it's always been very well sought after for many empires over the thousands of years. And so you've seen that. You look at the history of it. You've had, the Ottomans, you've had the Romans, you've had all these different empires and groups come through and mix and mingle, and different forms of domination and control and change. And it's really mixed together into this beautiful culture that is Palestinian culture, those who have descended from those people. For those who don't know, the land today is kind of split into, I suppose, three main areas. You've got what is now the state of Israel, which is over around, I think, 78% of the land. Then the West Bank, which is on the west bank of the Jordan River. That's why it's called the West Bank. So that's kind of to the eastern side. And then to the western side, down south along the Mediterranean Sea, there's the Gaza Strip, which is just 365 square kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles for Americans who are listening, but it's very small, 41 kilometers at its longest length. And it's had, in the last 2 years, more bombs dropped on it than the entirety of the biggest cities during World War II. I think it's been the equivalent of over 6 atomic bombs or 6 Hiroshimas. Also understanding how it came to be divided up like that, and the absurdity of how it became divided up like that, I think is important, because I think for a lot of people, they became aware of this in and around October 2023. But this has been going on since since before, but the real kind of key date is 1948, or what Palestinians call the Nakba. That's when the state of Israel was declared over half of the land. So Britain kind of had control over it coming out the end of World War I, and basically said, hey, we're going to divide this land into 2 nations, one that's exclusively for the Jewish people and one that's for I think the quote was, non-Jewish residents. So they didn't even refer to them as Palestinians, or maybe at best they'd refer to them as the Arabs. And you still see the kind of way language is used today to kind of shape how people view these different groups. So that plan was rejected by the Arabs, by the Palestinians, because they lived in the 75% of that land that was going to become Israel. So during the Nakba, there was mass ethnic cleansing campaign where you had Zionist militias who went throughout the land. The Zionist militias, which then became what we know today as the Israeli army, went throughout the land, and they forcibly displaced or ethnically cleansed over 750,000 people from 530 villages. In its own right, a genocide and a campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it's a key fact, because I think a lot of people kind of look at it and just see it as this debate over who has a right to the land. The reality is you can go and visit these villages. A lot of them are still sitting there abandoned. I think 77% of them haven't been built on top of. The other percent of them have been built on top of and populated and are now, big Israeli cities. But, I went and visited Lifter village in West Jerusalem with Jacob Alder, who's 84 years old. Lovely, lovely old man, incredibly wise, incredibly humble. And it was just both the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing, walking through this old village with him, and he's pointing across saying, that's the house where I grew up. These are the streets where I used to race my friends home from school. That's the bakery where my mum used to make the most delicious bread. Like these really rich memories of life before this horrific displacement. And so that's where you have communities today, huge refugee communities, both throughout the West Bank and Gaza, and living in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and around the world. Over half of the Palestinian population are living in exile in the diaspora, and the rest are kind of internal refugees. So you have people even living within the Israeli territories. They've been granted Israeli citizenship, but they can't return to their towns that in some cases are just like a 10-minute drive away. You've ended up with this really splintered people group of Palestinians, many of them still living in refugee camps. And that's where you get a lot of these kind of resistance efforts are from, are these groups who are wanting to return to their homes. 80% of Gaza are refugees who were displaced during the Nakba. And now they see these Israeli towns that have been built around Gaza while they're effectively imprisoned within Gaza with limited infrastructure, facing constant bombardment. The bombing didn't start on October 7th. Gaza was being bombed, I think, just 3 weeks prior to October 7th. And again, none of this justifies the violence or particular war crimes.
Absolutely not.
It contextualizes it. It says, actually, if we want to address this, we can't ignore the root issues. It didn't happen in a vacuum. There is context behind this. And if we want to move towards a meaningful, lasting peace, we actually need to address the injustice.
I couldn't have said it better myself. You've provided such great historical and cultural context, so thank you for that. You mentioned refugee camps. I'd like to explore with you what it was like living in Aida, a refugee camp. What was your first impression of people, the culture, and life within camp?
Yes, so Aida Camp is one of the 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. But there's 3 refugee camps. The second largest one is Aida. It's on the kind of northern side. It's right by the big, you may have seen photos of the large concrete, what they call the apartheid wall, which cuts off the West Bank from the Israeli territories. 85% of it is built within the West Bank, so it's used to kind of annex a lot of territory, and that's the same for this camp. But arriving into the camp, it was just such a beautiful privilege to get to live there. Like the community there are so kind. Really warm, really welcoming place. People are really, especially at the moment, really, really pleased to see foreigners around, because since COVID-19 and since the war, there's not been many tourists, and Bethlehem depends so hugely on tourism. It just felt so welcomed. As soon as I tell them as a journalist as well, they're like incredibly supportive. They're like, thank you for coming to share our stories, especially recognizing how often international media and journalism does a really poor job of reflecting their stories, intentionally or unintentionally, and feeds off a lot of stereotypes.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just wanted to pop in and say if the news and you is something you love listening to, you can help me to keep it going by joining my Patreon community. Your support helps me tell more stories that matter, the kind that brings about compassion and a deeper understanding for others, culture, and the world around us. If you believe in the work we do, head to patreon.com/Eleisha Foon. That's ELEISHAFOON. The link's in the bio, and be sure to follow The News and You on Instagram for more behind-the-scenes moments, announcements, and updates. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get back into the conversation.
I'll take you with me on a journey. So you kind of enter the camp, you've got really kind of thin streets, tall, narrow buildings, because these are camps that began as tent cities, essentially, when people fled their homes during the Nakba in 1948. And so it's just kind of developed from there. They thought maybe we'll be there for a few months, and maybe we'll be here a few years longer. And then when they realized this is a longer term thing, they built, little kind of tin shacks, which then became concrete buildings, which then as the families continued to grow and the camp got more and more populated, it couldn't spread outwards. And so people were forced to build upwards, which is also a very a cultural thing as well. You live together, and so the parents live on the bottom story, then the kids the level above, and the grandkids the next level. And then, when one generation passes away, everyone kind of shifts down a level, and the next generation, intergenerational family living as well. It's also pretty sobering reminder that they're built like that because they're not given great infrastructure. The water situation as well is a big one. Everyone has water tanks on their roofs because all the water across the West Bank is controlled by Israel. In Aida Camp, for example, the last 2 or 3 months that I was there, they didn't have any water being pumped in through the pipes. And so they had to bring water in trucks and pump it up onto their roof. And so even when they do have it coming through the pipes, they store it in tanks on their roof because they might have it for one day in every 2 weeks. So if you run out of water in that time, you're out of water. And Aida Camp in particular, I think, highlights just a lot of the elements of the occupation, because we're talking about a refugee camp here, but Aida Camp is one of the most tear-gassed places on the planet. There was a 2017 study that found it's been the most tear-gassed place. And so you've got a whole bunch of health issues that then come from that. Mothers who have birth issues, a large number of people with disabilities who cannot get the services that they need, and especially in, a place with not ideal infrastructure, that then makes accessibility really difficult as well. One of my friends who's a journalist in Aida Camp, she was going to a dress shop to pick up a dress, what should have been kind of a 15-minute trip, but there was a military raid and she ended up stuck in that shop for 2 hours. And then when they finally got out, there was tear gas in the streets, and so they had to kind of go back in, and the house windows were open, so then the whole house stunk of tear gas. For those who've never been tear gas before, which hopefully is most people listening, it's a really horrible experience. I experienced it for the first time last year in Hebron. It's the city in the southern West Bank. I had arrived, and within about half an hour, we were walking to my friend's house. We hopped out of the car because there were soldiers up the street turning all the cars around. So we hopped out and kind of tried to walk, and then they turned us around by foot as well. So we couldn't get through. So we simply had to wait. And then to kind of announce their departure, they fired off 2 tear gas canisters just for the sake of it. They've been holding people up at gunpoint and everything up until this point. Fired off 2 tear gas canisters. And man, it just it stings. Your eyes are just burning, and it feels like you can't breathe, even though you should be able to. It's like swallowing a bunch of mustard seeds at once or something. It's very sore. In this particular case, when we were tear gassed in Hebron, the military left, and we realized all these parents kind of came in around the corner and opened the gate where they'd been, and all these kids started coming out, and we realized they'd fired off this tear gas from right outside a school, which had just finished, but everyone just kind of continued on with life like it was the usual kind of part of the school day. And in fact, it kind of is. Dr. Maya Tamimi, who's a wonderful Palestinian woman down in Dunedin in New Zealand, she said, actually, I grew up in Hebron, and we faced this so often in our schools that we would take a half slice of onion to school with us each day, because you kind of you breathe in onion as this kind of antidote, stabilizes the tear gas a little bit. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it more bearable. And she said this is what she experienced. Every week as a kid, their school would be tear gassed or nearby to their school, and so they always carried this onion slice with them. All across the West Bank, it's used so often. And I hadn't realised, but it's actually banned in war. You're not allowed to use tear gas in war, and yet you have governments and regimes using it on people in the streets daily.
It's horrific, and I really hope people listening understand that we're living in a time when there's a lot of distrust in media. And so I'm really grateful for individuals like yourself, someone who's a Kiwi, someone who I can personally vouch for is someone with very strong ethics and values, and is also a person of faith. So you've been put in a very unique position to be a truth teller and a witness, and to carry these stories with you as well. And my hope is that it really opens people's hearts and minds to the realities, the really harsh realities and the human rights atrocities that are going on and that have been happening for such a long time. There's just so much that I want to cover, and I think it's really important as well to touch on just how close you came to experiencing what is very common, which is death in Palestine. You had a very close friend pass away, and I was wondering if you could share about him and what happened.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned earlier the village of Khair down south in the Musafir Yatta region of the West Bank. So it's this beautiful Bedouin village of, I think, around 200 people. And I first visited there last year when we heard that these house demolitions were taking place. We arrived and there were 11 homes being demolished in one day. And we just watched these families as their lives were destroyed and crushed into rubble. And then we returned 3 weeks later, and they were still clearing the rubble. It still looked much the same as it had been the weeks prior, because they can't bring in their own heavy machinery to clear it. So they've faced difficulties like this for years, and it's really heavy. And in the case of Khair, it becomes very obvious that this is about a land grab. You've got a settlement that has been built literally right next door. In some places, it's just meters away from their homes, and they're hemmed in. They can't expand elsewhere. They can't even shepherd their sheep now, which is huge for Bedouin. And so they've been living under this kind of oppressive daily reality where you have settlers coming from the settlement and harassing them, beating them, vandalizing their homes and their property, and police and military who come along and facilitate that and take part as well. But I think it really it becomes undeniably obvious how intertwined all of these systems are. I mean, so often, but I think particularly in the story of Aida, who was the first person I got connected with in the village. He was a father, a human rights defender, a massive football fan, really proud of his Bedouin heritage, just a really lovely guy. And yeah, he was the first person to kind of show me around their village and explain these elements elements to me and explain their story of how they were displaced there during the Nakba as well. And they sold half of their flocks in order to buy this piece of land. And then the settlement was built over half of it. And slowly it's been encroaching further and further on their land. And he has been documenting that for years as a human rights defender. In fact, people might be aware of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land. Yeah, he was one of the key contributors to that. Settlers who had come into their village on the 28th of July, and they had come in there with a digger, and they were excavating right out behind the village's community centre, so flattening land in order to prepare it to put some illegal houses on. So they were going to expand the settlement right into the centre of the Palestinian village. And towards the end of the day, they started rolling across private Palestinian land, crushing pipes and olive trees and their sewage outlet and so forth. And so the villagers came out and they tried to block this digger. And the digger driver knocked one of them out with the boom of the digger. And so everyone got really scared. They thought he had been killed. And so they started kind of throwing stones and trying to get this digger to go away. This isn't a digger. It's a digger that's designed to break stones. So there's not really a threat. But the settler, Yinon Levy, who was heading up this excavation, he came towards them and pulled out a pistol, and just you can find the footage online of it, and he just looked absolutely crazed, and he fires off 2 shots towards where people are gathered. And my friend Aida was documenting about 30 meters away. He wasn't part of any of the action. He was just standing there with his camera filming, and he got shot in the heart and just immediately collapsed. And people kind of realized after a few seconds what had happened and rushed over there and called the ambulances. And because of all the restrictions and the checkpoints and the roadblocks, Palestinian ambulances, it's very difficult to get there in time. And so they picked him up and carried him to the settlement and got an Israeli ambulance to come and help him. But he didn't make it. The ambulance took him, and they kind of parked under the trees nearby for a little bit, and then finally took him off to the Israeli hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. And it's pretty sobering, I think, just repeating it when you see the whole story, but it was particularly just really disturbing. Alda was also he updated me all the time, so I was constantly getting different WhatsApp messages from him, different things happening. And so he was messaging hey, there's a digger that's come into the village, they're excavating behind the community centre. And I was getting these messages, and then next thing I see this footage on Instagram of this crazy settler firing off some shots, and I thought, wow, that's insane. And then the next was this update: Alda's been shot, and then nothing. And we're just waiting to hear news. And then the guy who was in my apartment at the time came over and said, such and such at the community centre that said that someone's been killed down south by a settler. And I said, no, that'll be my friend Aida. He hasn't been killed. He's just been shot. And he said, no, this guy said he's been killed. And so I went back online, and sure enough, it was his cousins and brothers announcing Aida has been killed. He's died. Following his death, which was all filmed on camera, the Israeli police and military turned up, and instead of addressing the killer or arresting him, they took, under the killer's instructions, they went and arrested a bunch of Alda's brothers and cousins and took them away. And his killer, Yinon, was also taken away, Yinon Levy. He's a settler who's been sanctioned by many countries around the world, including New Zealand. We've placed a travel ban on him, thinking that that's going to change things. He was giving instructions to the military, and they followed it. And so then over the next few days, over a series of raids, they arrested over 22 of the village's residents and held them in prison. And when I chatted to them afterwards, they reported they faced abuse, just intimidation, horrific conditions in prison for doing nothing wrong. It was their brother who was killed in front of them, their cousin, and they faced all of that horror. And the killer, Yinon, was released within 24 hours. He was released to home detention, and within 5 days he was released free. And within a week he was back in the village excavating, no consequences. Alda's body was seized by the Israeli authorities and held for days and days and days. And Muslim burial rites is you try to bury them quickly the next day or the following day if possible. And they couldn't do that because they didn't have his body. So over 60 of the village's women went on hunger strike, aged from 13 through to 70 years old, to protest that and to call for their loved ones to be returned from prison as well. And finally, 10 days later, Alda's body was released with several conditions that he couldn't be buried in the village, he had to be buried next door. And they said, but how people can attend the funeral, but then they set up 2 roadblocks and they stopped people from attending the funeral. Fortunately, I was in the village at the time when it was announced, and so I could kind of sneak down, and we did this big kind of hour-long journey sneaking around the valley in order to get up again into the next village over without being stopped by the police and military, just to be there for his funeral. But there's, people who've been friends with him for years and years, just the closest of friends, including many Israeli activists who just weren't able to attend his funeral, weren't able to say a proper goodbye. So yeah, and the village has just continued to face intimidation and abuse. The area of land behind the community centre that was excavated now has 8 housing units that's been placed on it. So the whole village is being cut in half by this new settlement outpost. So an outpost is a settlement, but it's not just illegal under international law, it's also illegal under Israeli law. In fact, the Israeli courts ruled the other day that this new settlement in the middle of al-Khair is illegal, and yet people still continue. The military turn up, they don't stop it, they just continue to facilitate building it, and people move in, and then it becomes an official settlement, and next thing, al-Khair village will be empty of its residents, and they won't have homes to go to.
It's so heartbreaking. I'm so sorry for your loss. It's just, it's devastating.
Yeah, it's very surreal, and it's just, I think it just highlights so many aspects of the cruelty of the occupation, just the inhumanity, the supremacy that it's kind of driven by, and the fact that it's not just this kind of fringe group. Like it's not a broken system. It's a system working exactly as it's supposed to. The settlers, the military, the police, the court, all work hand in hand to force Palestinians off the land, because that's what this is about. It's a campaign of ethnic cleansing. You force them out, you claim the land, and slowly you build your bigger area of land. It's very systemic. I think that's one of the things that is often not understood or misrepresented by media and by people around the world, by lots of different groups. It's kind of seen as this, it's just this conflict, it's this debate over land, it's some kind of religious battle. Like it's none of those things. It's just another case of settler colonialism, like we have here in Aotearoa, like we have in Australia and America, across the world. It's just a more modern case. It's got a lot more sophisticated weaponry, a lot more sophisticated systems. But that's exactly what it is. It's settler colonialism. It's a project that is coming in to displace the people who are in the land and replace them with another bunch of people. Like it's not like I mentioned earlier, lots of the empires that have come through previously, they came through to control it and to exploit the resources, but the people remained the same and mixed and mingled, and you've got this rich melting pot as a result. But now what we're seeing is a settler colonial project that is coming in and forcing out the people who are in the land and forcing them out in the name of religion, which is a very easy tool to weaponize. I mean, we've seen how Christianity was weaponized in instances of settler colonialism here in New Zealand and America and Australia, colonialism under the Jewish banner. And many Jews around the world are standing up and saying, no, this isn't our religion. They're standing against it very strongly because it just smears everything that their religion is about.
There's this almost defense or justification of what we saw, because we've got to get rid of Hamas. We need to take out leaders. We need to take out tunnels under these cities. So what is your response to people who are concerned about Hamas?
The use of this word terrorism is really dangerous, because you paint someone with the brush terrorism and suddenly anything's on the table to get rid of them. And, war crimes were committed on October 7th. But I think you need to look wider than that and see that actually there is support for different movements of armed resistance, or whatever you want to call it. These movements don't come around in a vacuum. As I was saying earlier, there's a history of what has gone on here that has led to the creation of such groups and led to people joining such groups. 80% of Gaza are refugees who were forcibly displaced, ethnically cleansed from their homes in 1948, and have since then been living in horrific conditions in what people have referred to as an open-air prison, except they never committed a crime to be put in prison, so it's better described as a concentration camp or it's captivity. And Israel, for decades, have controlled what goes in and out of Gaza. Under those conditions, there's been widespread unemployment, there's been widespread depression. I think this is the other thing people need to understand. Palestinians and Palestinian civil society has taken so many creative, non-violent pathways. There've been sit-ins, hikoi, we call them in New Zealand, like marches, protests. There've been so many different kind of forms of creative campaigning. There's been, up in the north, there's villages that have kind of gone and tried to kind of reoccupy their land because it's just sitting there as a national park instead. In Aida Camp, there's people take the tear gas canisters that are fired there and they cut it up and turn it into beautiful little pieces of jewellery. You've got academics who kind of write about what a future could look like free from this domination and systems. And so you've got all these different pathways that people have tried to take. You've got the BDS movement, boycotts, divestment, sanctions. So those are some of the most effective tools of non-violence that we have. But because those pathways haven't been supported by the international community and by governments, they haven't worked. They haven't had the effectiveness that they're supposed to have. You've seen people living under oppression, living under these horrific regimes, facing bombardment. A lot of the people who are currently members of Hamas are people who will have lost family members in earlier bombardments of Gaza, or faced prison time themselves, faced abuse, faced the constant dehumanization. Again, none of this stuff justifies war crimes or atrocities. But most people, that's not how they see Hamas. Hamas isn't war crimes and atrocities. And this has been something I've asked Palestinian friends about as well. What is the nature of this group? They're a political movement, and they have an armed aspect to them as well. And that was the group that committed the October 7th attack. But I think when you smear this whole group as a terror organization, it sets up for a whole bunch of atrocities. We need consistent standards. I think a lot of the kind of pointing the finger at Hamas or at any form of resistance, because when Palestinians commit non-violent resistance, it's also kind of smeared as this unacceptable thing. When people pin the blame wholly, we're seeing all kinds of atrocities that Israel have been committing. We're seeing a genocide that Israel's committing in Gaza. And it's gotten to the point where even the people who have been denying it for months and months now aren't denying it. They say, yes, those things are happening, but it's Hamas's fault. The thing I'd say, to pin the blame on that, for instance, the argument about human shields. Hamas is in the hospitals. So actually, it's not Israel's fault for bombing the hospital. They had to. If Hamas were hiding in a hospital in Israel, you would not see the IDF bombing that hospital. Or if a serial killer is hiding in a school in New Zealand, it would not be acceptable to go in and obliterate the school in order to get the serial killer. So this kind of argument that justifies these war crimes is not acceptable. Find another way. If you are actually targeting them, find another way. But also, the widespread indiscriminate nature of Israel's attacks in Gaza has made it very clear they're not just targeting this militant group. They're targeting civilians, and they have been for ages. I mean, the number of civilians who have been killed just trying to seek aid and food at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation food sites. The use of white phosphorus, which is illegal against international law, that's been used so often. I remember late 2023, there was in fact, just in October 2023, there was a big discussion when Al Ahli Hospital was bombed, and Israel saying, no, that wasn't us, we never bomb hospitals. And now every single hospital in Gaza has either been bombed or displaced multiple times in many cases. The whole health infrastructure system has been completely dismantled. It's just been crazy to see the shift of what we initially saw as completely unacceptable to now things that have just become so normalized. We're having hundreds of people killed each day at aid sites seeking food, and we just kind of shrug and say, well, that's horrible, but it doesn't shock people anymore. Again, that's the really clever thing of creating this group that you can constantly point the finger back to. And again, I'm not here to defend Hamas. Hamas wouldn't have my vote as a political party or a resistance movement. But I think we need to move beyond simplistic narratives that just view them as some kind of anything's on the table, because it's not. There are humans and people living in there. And I think the argument about embedding themselves in amongst the civilian population, I mean, we saw when Iran were firing rockets at Israel, rockets hitting main towns and centers, and people said, why are they firing those there? And then they realized because Israel have military bases and army infrastructure embedded amongst civilians as well. It's a real double standards thing, and I don't want any of that to come across as me rationalizing those things. What I'm saying is I think people need to look beyond double standards.
Coming up next time on The News and You, Part 2 of Genocide in Gaza. Cole Martin takes us inside the faith debate surrounding the conflict.
There's a real kind of fear and demonization of Islam that again is built on double standards. There are groups in the world who have weaponized Islam for their own ends. But there are groups in the world that have weaponized, as we're seeing in Gaza, Judaism to their own ends. There are groups in the world, as we're seeing, actually argue as a Christian more so than any other group. I think Christianity, when paired with empire, has been one of the most harmful forces in the world.
He confronts how church theology and biblical interpretations have, in some cases, been used to justify Israel's actions in Gaza, and asks what happens when scripture is weaponized in war. We explore the intersection of religion, politics, and power, grappling with questions of justice, truth, and faith in times of conflict. Thank you for listening to The News and You. Your support means the world. If you believe in the work we do at The News and You, sign up to our Patreon. It really is the best way to keep this going and be part of the Newsies community. I'd be so grateful if you can share the love by leaving a rating and review. It'll help spread these stories even further. What are your key takeaways? If this story impacted you, or even made you see the world a little differently, why not share it with your friends and family? Until next time, remember, your story matters, and there's a shared truth behind everything.